Nick told me I could do the philosophical stuff, and he would do something else. And so I will do the philosophical stuff. My remarks are going to concern the notion of right as the notion of right as it figures in human rights and the place in, or lack thereof perhaps, in discourses about wealth inequality. So my goal is not to establish that the language of human rights has no place in discussions of wealth inequality. I'm not trying to be a skeptic. What I want these remarks to do is warn against some traps and some potholes one might fall into when discussing wealth inequality, or inequity, I guess I should say this way. If we want to talk about rights in the context of discussions of income inequality, you'll have to teach me the distinction between inequality and inequity later. Inequity. One of the first questions we'll want to establish, I think, is whether we're saying that individuals and or groups have a right to some good, or whether they have a right not to have certain acts performed on or against them. This distinction might not be tidy. That is, there might be cases where a good can be delivered only through restraining certain actions. But to get this distinction off the ground between rights to some good as opposed to rights not to have stuff done to you, let's work with a few basic examples, I think. I think a good example of a right to a good, if it's enjoyed, is the universal right to health care. If a nation decides its citizens have this right, and if a citizen gets sick, she has the right to demand that certain other citizens, namely healthcare providers, take care of her and help her get well. What that right requires in order to be satisfied is the positive actions of others, namely that the healthcare providers do their job and make her better. A right of the other sort, or the right not to have certain stuff done to you, is a right not to be mugged, for example. So realizing this right doesn't require that anyone do any particular thing, perform any positive action, as much as it requires that we all not do something, not run around mugging each other. Okay, so with this distinction drawn, which I'll admit a bit crudely, between a right to certain positive actions and a right to have others not do certain things to you, I want to ask, if we say income inequity is an issue of human rights, are the rights in question of the first kind or the second kind? And to my ear, the most natural way to hear this is the first way, that it's a good that we expect others to do something actively to help those who lack it obtain. The good in question would seem to be income, and it seems to me that the relevant bodies that would do the providing would be either governments or employers. Those are the two that come naturally to mind. I'm going to close with some remarks about the challenges that we might face if we want to think about wealth inequity as a human right in that way, as some good that requires the positive action of others to be delivered. Instead, before getting to that rather, I want to talk about some of the practical advantages of thinking about human rights in the opposite sort of way, rights not to have injuries committed against one. And the particular advantage I want to note is that as a practical matter, it's easier to develop and enforce policies and laws that require us all not to do something than it is to develop policies and laws, and I might add institutions, that positively deliver some good. Now this point has recently been made by Kwame Anthony Appiah in his 2005 book, The Ethics of Identity. And he has, in a section called Globalizing Human Rights, Appiah argues that a benefit of couching claims of injustice in terms of violations of human rights in an international context has been that this language facilitates cross-cultural dialogue and action on these injustices. And his thought here is that by claiming something as a human right, an individual or a group can make itself understood across different worldviews, say of human nature, or of the nature of the universe, or of God. As Appiah puts it, we do not need to agree we are all created in the image of God, or that we all have natural rights that flow from our human essence, to agree that we do not want to be tortured by government officials, that we do not want to be subjected to arbitrary arrest, or to have our lives, family, or property forfeited. He notes, though, that these appeals to rights are most effective when the rights demanded are of the second sort, rights not to have certain things done to you. And this is evident from his examples, right? His examples are of the right not to be tortured, not to be subjected to arbitrary arrest, and not to have one's property forfeited. He worries about the effectiveness of demanding universal human rights that require positive action to be implemented. So one example that he talks about in this section is a right to universal education. And he makes clear that he thinks that universal education is ethically and socially extremely important. And indeed, he suggests that most of the things that we find most ethically and socially important are goals that require positive action to strive for. So if they are so important, what is his reluctance then towards talking about these goals and goods by using the language of rights? The worry is that talking about goals and goods of this sort using the language of rights is that it makes all talks of rights empty, that it eliminates the effective power of such language. So to return to the example of universal education, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights lists the right to education as one of its universal rights. But of course, implementing this right requires the development of all sorts of institutions. And as Appia notes, for many countries, it is, to say the least, a challenge to develop these institutions due to economic restrictions. In those countries, to say that there is a universal right to education, he worries, amounts to little more than saying that it's a very nice idea that everyone have education. And he worries that if that's all that the language of rights talk amounts to, that it strips it of its power to make actual demands that must be respected. All right. Now we might worry that when Appia says this, he's just offering, the effect of doing this is to offer an apology of poorly run and corrupt governments. That is, in many places where education is poor, plenty of the blame belongs on ineffective and corrupt governments, not simply to lack of resources. And to the extent that this is true, you might worry that Appia's remarks have the effect of letting these off the hook from a human rights standpoint. You might think that without describing education as a universal human right, you lose the language to hold corrupt governments responsible and accountable for their failures to deliver education to their people. Maybe that's all correct, but I still think that there are two things that write about what Appia says here that I want to pick up for our discussion. First, Appia doesn't say that it's wrong to talk about goods like universal education using the language of rights. He simply worries, again, that doing so strips this language of its power. And that's because of the second point I want to make, which I've already stated, that it's easier to say and enforce that a certain course of action, take any sort of physical violence as an example, will not be tolerated on grounds of rights than it is to develop the institutions necessary for delivering goods. Again, it should be evident, I'm inclined to agree with Appia on this point. So I invite us in the course of this discussion to think about whether there are ways of discussing human rights and wealth inequity that can be described negatively as rights not to have such and such done to oneself. I'm not sure that there are, but maybe there are. I think that that'd be a nice thing to talk about. If we can't, then I think there are some immediate and fairly obvious worries that we should have about talking of wealth inequity as something an individual has a positive right to. And perhaps the chief one is that a right to wealth equality will be realized, it seems, by taking those who have some wealth and getting them to relinquish it. And this runs counter to a right that is far more widely accepted, at least in the United States, which is a right to private property. That right, stated more specifically and explicitly, is the right not to have what you own taken from you. And the line of thought that one who stands behind such a right will perhaps be predictable to this audience. It's one that if you go home and turn on cable news television after this forum, you will probably find within 10 or 15 minutes. The line of thought goes like this: what's mine is mine because I earned it. I have a right to do with it what I want. And if someone else wants more wealth, then they need to go out and earn it themselves just the way that I did. Okay, that's a line of thought that can be backed up by appeal to property rights. And there are plenty of ways to challenge this line of thought. For example, the thought that there is a simple function that connects effort exerted and wealth earned, I think, is at very best naive. But if you want to challenge somebody who thinks about things in that way, you might be better off explaining why something like a purported connection between wealth and effort is naive, than saying that there is a fundamental human right to wealth equity. Okay, so just a little more, almost done. There might be, taxing the wealthy might not be the only way to achieve more equal wealth, though. So I'm imagining maybe another way that you could get wealth equity would be through imposing a salary cap, maybe on the top wealth earners, and requiring them, once they get to, who knows, $10, $20 million, all that excess surplus wealth needs to be redistributed to charities or government, or they've got employees to employees or something like that. And if someone said that, you could imagine the predictable responses again. One being that this infringes upon my right of property to do what I want with my property. Another being maybe that this would mess with free markets and that that's a bad thing. Again, I think that defenses along these lines are naive at best, But again, if you wanted to challenge somebody who thought this, you'd do well to call into question the idea that free markets, when left alone, always function for the best or are inherently rational. You might do better if you said that than by appealing to something like an inherent human right for wealth equity. Okay, again, my closing thought is that I'm not attempting by saying this to take off the board that we talk about wealth inequity in terms of human rights. Instead, I mean only to raise some worries about what incautious use of that language might lead us to say, putting out some avoidable potholes so that we can have a discussion that goes somewhere.
Thank you.